So my presentation will be in English, and I'll focus on one specific initiative, the title of which is on the board, second line, which is Building Bridges, a Catholic-Muslim project on education, dialogue, and collaboration. This project started in the months that followed the Abu Dhabi Declaration on human fraternity, and it's a work in progress. We were hoping to actually launch the website with all of its components, in fact, 2 days ago, to coincide with the 5th anniversary of the declaration, but due to some reasons which I will explain in a moment in this presentation, in my analysis, there's been delays. So first, I will give you a bit of a context to the Canadian realities in terms of religious identities. Then I will briefly give you a few elements of this future websites, as well as mostly concentrate my few minutes on an analysis from a contextual sort of perspective of the challenges faced in the application of this declaration, with a few brief concluding thoughts. So first, if you look at the recent census in Canada, to have a sense of the demographics on religious identities, it's very important. If you look up at the top, you have the general idea of Canada as a whole, with 53% defining themselves as Christians in one way or another. The majority of which are Roman Catholics. Then the second group is 35% more or less of people who do not self-identify religiously in any way. And then finally the 12% is a variety of different minority groups of different religious and spiritual traditions. And you have the breakdown by province here, but since not all of you are able to look at that, and also because of time, I'll skip the details. The second part, which is useful, you cannot see from the legend at the bottom, but the light blue is the census from 2001. The dark blue is the census from 2011, and the red is the census of 3 years ago, 2021. So if you look at the 12% of religious minorities in Canada, the largest group, 4.9% today, is Muslims. And you can see the growth over 20 years, doubling in numbers. In comparison, the Jewish population slightly reduced in numbers over that 20-year period. And finally, you have the other religious communities at the bottom. And so that represents sort of the reality of the country as a whole, but it varies a lot depending on where you are. And it's very important to understand that the vast majority of the Muslim population are in larger cities of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Now, having said that, let me sort of show you what the actual sort of website of this initiative looks like. As again, it's not publicly accessible yet, but we hope to do that very soon. And when you look at the top right, you see the menu, and under the menu, you'll find sort of the elements to the right. And I just want to draw your attention in particular to the monographs part, and there are 6 of them, and this is really the heart of the website, because these are documents that were written by a team of experts, both official representatives from the Canadian Council of Imams and of the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops. The first being started in 1990, the CCI, and the Conference of Bishops was founded in 1943. But together, they came together in 2019 in order to say, well, let's implement a project based on the Abu Dhabi Declaration. And so the first element is really an attempt to look at Roman Catholic Church's approach to interreligious dialogue, because of course of the 2 communities, it's the oldest one in Canada. Then look at Islamic perspective on dialogue as a second document. Each of these documents being written separately by Catholics first and Muslims second. The third document is on stereotypes about Catholicism from a Catholic perspective, and of course the equivalent for Muslims, so stereotypes about Islam. And a jointly written document by, in fact, Muslim and Christian women participants in the organizing team, a Catholic and Muslim reflection on humility and modesty, which was really to address the issue of the hijab in particular, given that that is often a site of controversy, that women, Muslim women in particular, end up sort of having to bear the brunt of a lot of Islamophobic reactions because of that. But we didn't want to call it that, so this is the title that was given to the document. And the last one is Catholic and Muslims in Canada, Friendships and Common Cause, looking at the history and the sort of different kinds of interactions that took place over the last few decades. So that's in a nutshell the website. Now, if we look at the analysis, and there are several multifactorial challenges within which this project has been developing, but there are also potential benefits. I have 2 slides on the challenges and 1 on the benefits before my concluding thoughts. Challenges, there's a lot of them. Conceptually, and this is probably the most important part of what I want to share today, and that is that the Christian-Muslim dynamic is bilateral, but it doesn't take place in a vacuum, meaning that there are many Christians in the Christian-Muslim dialogue that are also participating in Jewish-Christian dialogue. And of course, there are Muslims who participated in Jewish-Muslim dialogue. And finally, a few people in a trilateral Abrahamic kind of dialogue, let alone the fact that all of them participate often in multi-religious kinds of dialogues. So there are challenges at times as to understand sort of the differences between these different kinds of bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral dialogues. There are other forms of dialogue as well that are taking place, whether it's inter-civilizational, intercultural, inter-spiritual, or inter-worldview, but that includes notions of intersectionality and power dynamics around multiple identities, religion being just one of them. That last form, the inter-worldview dialogue, is particularly useful to include on an equal basis people with no religious affiliation together with people with religious identities. So these are challenges because, of course, the specifics of Christian-Muslim dialogue in Canada needs to take into account sort of that diversity of forms of dialogue and of multiple identities based on the statistics that I first showed you. Then, there's also another challenge, which is at first, the website presents very much an approach which Professor Mohammed Abu Nimr has called the difference between harmony versus liberation models of dialogue. Harmony model is focusing on finding the commonalities, the similarities between, in this case, Christians and Muslims. And in many ways, because it's an introductory kind of website for people that may not have had a previous experience at dialogue between Islam and Christianity, it is really a model, this Building Bridge project, towards more of a harmony kind of dialogue. However, the realities in the last few weeks, literally, have actually sort of stressed the boundaries and often pushed a lot of participants towards what they would hope would be a liberation model of dialogue that actually addresses political issues. So much more challenging, of course, for dialogical processes. Canada is a wide, huge country, so of course distance is a problem, and often cost of traveling to meet each other is difficult. That's why the project tries to root itself at the parish level to avoid sort of these problems. Demographically speaking, the changing nature of immigration, the stats that I showed you, also sometimes affects the psychology of how one particular religious identity feels about its position in a particular society. And these are real versus relative numbers, because all of the groups, except the Jewish population, have actually increased in numbers, but their relative weight sometimes is not necessarily increasing as much, or not at all sometimes. And finally, I think it's important for Canadians to understand that Islam is really steadily now the major second religion in the country, and not all Canadians are necessarily sort of ready to accept and deal with what that means, as they have been influenced, as we will see later on, by a variety of different social media as well as general media depictions of an overwhelmingly kind of negative image about Islam over the last few decades. But obviously this is not the reality of the majority Muslim behaviors worldwide. But unfortunately there is a distortive dynamics due to media impact. Then the movement, as mentioned in the declaration, from minorities to common citizenship is something that we're trying to work on in Canada as well. But there are exceptions, because in Quebec you still have a nationalism at the provincial level that seeks, at least for more or less 30–40% of the population, to seek a Quebec independence movement. And in that context, ethno-nationalism is the basis of national discourse, and therefore it goes against the grain of trying to sort of treat everybody living within the boundaries of Quebec as equal citizens and with equal rights. And therefore there's been the problem, a political problem that has emerged, which I'll talk about in a few seconds, Bill 21, which does not allow sort of in any jobs that are funded by or paid by the government for anybody with religious garbs that are obviously religious garbs to be able to work in those positions or have improvement over their situation within that, those particular jobs, which means education, health services, lawyers, and police force as well. And so this, of course, goes against Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but nevertheless, this is part of the ways in which the consolidation of ethno-nationalism has taken a legal dimension in that part of Canada. There's a rise, of course, in the last 20-some years of a combination of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism. I don't have time to go into the distinction, but it's important to mention it. And therefore, there's an increased kind of fragility that takes place among Muslims because of their insecurity linked to that phenomena, as well as, of course, an increasing fragility of the Catholic identity sometimes in the country, which is rarely talked about, but which comes from two primary sources. Is the story of reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous peoples in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place a few years back, which of course has been throwing very critical light on past government and religious, especially Catholic and Anglican churches that went with often the residential school system that was, to say the least, assimilatory, but some would even go so far as calling a genocide of the cultures of Indigenous peoples, culture and languages of Indigenous peoples over decades. So the backlash of that has also caused some fragility to the Catholic identity or perceptions about Catholics in Canada, as well as the older historical realities of claims of sexual abuse on the part of some clergy, which is of course a minority behavior, but it's enough to destabilize and the perception, and there's been a variety of claims that have cost a lot of money to the Catholic Church, also decrease in its economic viability at the moment. So these make it fragile situation. Finally, of course, there's well, I mentioned that too. And despite all of these efforts and these challenges at the social level, the Canadian government under the current Liberal Party has had two summits that took place one day after another on the 21st and the 22nd of July 2021, so a little bit more than about 2.5 years ago. And one was on anti-Semitism, the second one was on Islamophobia. The Liberal government trying to provide an inclusive platform and dealing with rise in both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the country. And by putting them side by side, juxtaposing those two summits, the government was sending a message to the population in general that none of these kinds of hate speeches and hate crimes are tolerable in Canadian society. And so, but despite sort of those efforts politically, there's a lot of work that needs to happen on the ground, and thus the project comes in to help sort of the parishes of Muslim and Catholic parishes locally to try to address sort of the challenges that they're facing at the local level. Then I would say that, how many minutes? 5, there we go. So geopolitically, we have, of course, influences coming from the United States of America, our small neighbor to the south. There's been a general polarization of discourses at times, as well as, of course, movement towards the right, not something unknown to people also in Europe and other countries worldwide. There's various influences of global dynamics on federal and provincial politics, and that's where the example of Bill 21 in Quebec I just mentioned comes in. And this increases the insecurity that Muslims have in Canada and in Quebec in particular. And that's why sort of this kind of project, this initiation to call for greater dialogue between Muslims and Catholics, among others, is a really important step towards sort of better understanding and reduce stereotypes and hate speech and behaviors. There's a difficulty to make sense sometimes of the Abrahamic Accords within the diverse Canadian Muslim communities. Despite sort of course, the wellness and the good intentions and the importance of those accords for the long-term future, socioeconomically, the deeper the historical roots of a community, of course, the stronger the structures are. But that means that the Muslim community being more recently arrived in Canada than the Catholics that go back 400 years ago, of course, the stability and the depth of these institutions is often not the same, nor are their economic means. And so that times makes for a difficulty in balancing sort of the power dynamics between Catholics and Muslims in their dialogue. Educationally, of course, how do we translate sort of and make available the Abu Dhabi Declaration so that there's, in the face of an increased need for what we call digital literacy and interreligious literacy, because the challenges coming from social media in causing many of those stereotypes and negative understanding of the two religious traditions, let alone others, is huge and increasing. Fortunately, some educational schools in Canada are trying to develop these programs for social media literacy, but sadly in the province of Quebec, we've used to have a wonderful program on ethics and religious culture that addressed religious literacy in a wonderful way, but it's being cut. So they were going backwards. Of course, at the health level, the COVID pandemic basically took 3 years off of our project. That really was the major stumbling block in terms of time. At the same time, on the ground, religious communities came together and collaborated in new ways, in wonderful ways. That also different health ministries started to take account of needing to collaborate in developing more permanent structures relating to the needs, the specific needs health-wise of religious communities. So there, the collaboration and the dialogue has become sort of an action-oriented development that is very healthy. The priorities. You know, when is dialogue a priority? Not all religious communities will be in a position to prioritize dialogue, sadly. And currently, of course, I think that we have sort of a challenge with what I will call the IDF-Hamas war at the moment in Gaza and the rippling sort of environment around that causes, of course, a lot of insecurity and tension, competing victimization discourses at times, trying to influence the Canadian government, and therefore sort of all of this reality today is really making it difficult for our particular project, as other priorities obviously are being addressed by Muslim and at times also Jewish and Christian communities in particular when it comes to the Canadian reality, trying to respond to what's happening in that particular part of the Middle East, among other regions of the world. So challenging situations today that has slowed us back. Or slowed us down, rather, sorry. Finally, the benefits are several. Demographic, because changes in the communities at the local level means when there's more diversity, there's also more opportunity to make sure that there's no majority group that dominates everything, because there's a plurality of people. So it can be turned into a positive advantage. I'll skip because of the end here, but politically there's a shared responsibility that all people have in Canada now, as Canadian politics is moving towards addressing decolonization. That's a challenge that all religious people have today. And so educationally, how do we bring the results of this particular declaration to the school system is yet to be seen. But what I would like to end with is to say that this particular project, which is work in progress, is something that the rich context, the third point here, the rich contents of the Human Fraternity document, while being an invitation to all human beings, remains the fruit of a Catholic, primarily Sunni Muslim leadership initiative that can be received with different degrees of relevancy depending on a combination of identity and power dynamics. And so, this is a little challenging, but these are 6 different kinds of potential areas of resistance to wanting to really receive positively the Abu Dhabi Declaration. Because of time, I'm ending and saying that the Human Fraternity document undoubtedly serves as a rich source of inspiration for a more urgent than ever before inclusive human dialogue so as to learn to live better together for world peace. Thank you.